One of the things that I'm the most proud of that I built in my React developer career was that at this company that I was working at, I had to build a really complex and highly reusable data table component that we then went on and applied across the entire application. That component that I built was so good that it literally removed 50% of the entire code base, because in every single component, in every single page, they were copy pasting the same code to create the same table over and over again. So I created that one component. It was really beautiful, really good, and it saved 50% of the entire code base. I'm really proud. And actually, I wanted to make a video about that and really show how I built that table component, but it turns out I don't have to because someone else did. Someone built a really efficient, really reusable data table component using all of the modern tools and technologies that we use in React nowadays. And so in this video, we're going to look at that table component, we're going to look at the code, and I promise you, this is the best React table component. And if you have that need in your project, if you want to have a really complex and highly functional table in your application, use this. No doubt it is the best thing that I've seen, not even kidding. But first, before I get into that, I just want to quickly mention that if you haven't heard, I have a completely free newsletter called Import React, which, as the name implies, is all about React. You can use it to keep up to date with all the latest and greatest that is going on in the React world, which I do personally. And also, I share on there really cool tips and tricks that I don't really share anywhere else. If you're interested, once again, it's completely free. I left the link for you in the description. Check it out. Now, let's get into the video. All right, so this is the repository. It's Shadcn 7 Shadcn table. I don't know why you're sad, man, because this table is beautiful. You should be ecstatic about it. I'll leave a link in the description as well. You can highly check it out. And this is the demo of this table. So this is using React 19, the React compiler, Tanstack table, and Shadcn, and it has some custom components, some functionality, and the code is really clean, really reusable, and a great example of how to write senior level React code. This, by the way, contrary to the typical Tanstack table, if I'm not mistaken, supports server-side filtering, right? So I can actually add here a status, and this is actually going to fetch the data from the backend and just refresh it, right? So this is really typical of what you would want to use this table for. You can filter for things, you can select things, you can delete things, right? This is a really functional table, and you have all of this functionality here. And you can even go advanced mode, right? And you can now add advanced filters. Like I want to add this filter where the title contains Shadcn, right? No record, unfortunately, it's going to have Shadcn. You can add another filter, you can select add and or. This is like really complicated, right? Like to actually do this and to have dynamic filters and all of that, it's really complicated. And in my table component that I built, it took me so long to figure out how to actually do this. But as you're going to see, the way that I did this is really efficient, and the code is actually not that long. They managed to make it really simple, and they implemented a clever solution that I now want to share with all of you. So let's get into the code. So this is the project over here. So now let's go directly to the component that renders the table and then work our way from there. Let's go to src, components, data table, and then find data table.tsx. Let's look at this. Do I have to install dependencies? I think I should. pnpm install, just to make it things clear so that we don't have any actual errors. And there you go, that got installed. So as you can see here, we're using Tanstack table, right? And then we're using a bunch of other components and stuff like that. So let's see what we have. So we have the props here of the table, which receives the actual table from Tanstack table. If you're not familiar, Tanstack table, you use a hook, I believe, that gets you access to this table property. And then based on this table property, you can then call a bunch of methods on it to actually render out your columns, your headers, your rows, and all of that. We're going to see how that works in just a moment as we work our way through this code base. Then we have a floating bar component, which I believe we haven't seen it. It is this component over here, but it doesn't always work for me. I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe it doesn't work in advanced mode. It's this like component that floats here that you can just do things with it. Again, doesn't really matter. It's not the core of the table, but that's this floating bar component here. And then this is the data table component, right, that just renders everything, right? So it receives this table over here, which is what I said you get from Tanstack table, and then you use the table.getHeaderGroups, and then you map over all of the header groups, and these are essentially all of your headers, right? You render out here this table head, right? This is really clean because now you just call this function here, and then everything else we're using these components that I believe come from Shadcn to just render out all the specific tables and all the styles and everything that goes along with it, right? This is a component that instead just receives this table as a prop and then just calls its methods to render out all the individual pieces of the UI. Nothing really too complicated, and this is purely a UI component. You see here, we're doing the same exact thing with all of the table rows, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, this is exactly the same code as you would typically use if you were just using Tanstack table directly. Cool, so then let's look at where this component is actually getting used. So here we're going to do a search, and we're going to come here and just find the component use, and I believe it is going to be, here we go, data table. That's where we're using the data table. So we're using it in the tasks table over here, right? So this is a component that is supposed to render us a list of tasks, right? So this here we have a list of tasks. That is the component that is running this entire thing. So here we have some feature flags, which I don't think we really need to care about. Then we have here, oh, this is the new use API from React, which is really, really interesting, right? So what we have here is we have this promises that is getting passed through props. This is an array of 3 promises, and all of these are these functions here: get tasks, get task status count, and then get task priority counts. As you can see, if I go and open up and try to find this tasks table component and see where it is being used, it's being used here in the page component. So this is a server component, right? This is Next.js. It's a server component. It is the index page. And as you can see here, we have the promises here. We're doing promise.all, and then we're doing get tasks, get task status count, and all of that. But notice that we're not awaiting the promises at all. This is actually going to be an array of promises. We're not awaiting the result of the promises. Instead, we're just passing the promises directly to our tasks table. And then inside of our tasks table, we are consuming the promises using the use hook from React. So now what's happening is that we have these promises that are consumed inside of this tasks table component, but are defined outside of it in a server component. And then whenever these promises are consumed, then we're actually going to await the result of them. But this await is not going to happen inside of this tasks table component. It's actually going to happen in this suspense boundary over here. So whenever you're using the new use hook from React, you want to wrap the component that is using it with a suspense boundary. And now while the promises are being awaited, we are going to show this skeleton over here. And I believe we can see it. If we just reload, it's very quick, but you can see a skeleton while the promise is being awaited. This is how this works. So this is cool. This is like all the new latest and greatest things about React, right? Again, it's using React 19, the React compiler. Very good to see. And then over here, we are defining the columns, which is in a separate place. It's using this function here, get columns. And this is exactly the same pattern that I implemented when I built my custom table component. So what we have here is we just have a function that we're exporting that lives in a separate file over here. We're in the tasks table columns over here. And then we're just returning, right, all of our columns that are specific for that tasks table. Like here, we have the ID over here. We can specify a header, right? The header is going to have a checkbox. We can actually specify a component to render the specific row, like a checkbox. That is going to be this one over here, I believe. Yes, this checkbox, right? And then we can put some properties here, enable sorting, enable hiding, and then we're doing all of that for all of the columns. This is really cool because now the columns are defined in a separate place. You could even reuse columns. So let's say, for example, we wanted to reuse this select here, the select column on another table. What we could do is we can just export this object because it just is an object. We can export this in a different file and then just import it and append it here to this array, or prepend it in this case, right? This is a really cool way to make your columns super reusable, super extensible, and then you can just share them across your entire application. Now, obviously, in this code base, there is only one table, so there's no real need for that. But the fact that we put this here in a separate function is really cool because now it makes this component much smaller. And again, it's not responsible for defining its own columns, which is a really good thing to see. It follows the single responsibility principle. Then we have over here some filter fields. So these are all the ways that we can actually filter, right? So this, I believe, is pretty standard Tanstack table stuff, right? So we have here the status and then the priority, which is here, the status and the priority, and these are Shadcn components. We can just select things, right? We can clear the filters, and then it just automatically re-renders the entire application because, as you can see here, where is it? Because it changes the URL here at the top, right? It changes this URL, which in turn is going to, I believe, re-render this. Where is it? It's going to validate this server component over here and then get the new search params over here, the new filters, right? And then pass them to our tasks. And that is what actually gets us the new tasks that match these specific filters, right? So this is server-side filtering in action, and it's really cool. And then we have here some feature flags, which again, we're not really too concerned about. But then we have the core of all of this, which is the use data table. And this is a custom hook. And I want you to note here, as you're going to see, this hook has a lot of code in it, is doing a lot of things, but it's only returning one singular item, the table, right? So this is a great way of taking something that can be complex, abstracting it in a separate place, and then just returning one singular variable over here that we can then use and pass to these other components. So let's look at this use data table, right? So we're passing in here the data, we're passing the columns, the page count, the filter fields, some initial state, and some other properties over here. So let's open this up and let's look at this code. So this code over here starts off with some properties over here, and it is going to extend the table options from Tanstack table, but it's going to omit some of these properties because I assume it wants to do other things with them, or they might no longer be needed. Again, I haven't gone too deep into this code base. Feel free to do so. You have a link to it in the description. Let's just look kind of the overview of how this custom hook works. So we have here some filter fields, which are these ones that we're passing here, right? So all of the ways that we're filtering them, right? So we're going to then use them in this component. We have some history behavior, some scroll, some shallow. We don't really care about these specific things. Some start transition. I'm not sure why this is passed, but I'm sure that there's a really good reason. And everything else seems like pretty typical, nothing really fancy or overcomplicated. Then we're setting here some default values for all of our props, which is totally fine. And then let's see how we're actually using this. So we have query state options over here, which is only going to return to us the options from our query state. Okay, that doesn't seem too complicated. I am a bit confused why we are using React use memo here, because this is running the React compiler. So maybe, 5 months ago, maybe this is yet to be refactored. I'm not entirely sure, but if we're using the compiler, we shouldn't really use memo. This should be automatically memoized for us. Then we have some state over here. So row selection, these are the individual rows that are currently selected, right? So as I can select this is actually updating the state of how many rows are selected. You can even see it here at the bottom, 5 out of 10 rows selected. This should be state. This should not be part of the URL because this doesn't really need to be a part of the URL. So that's fine. We also have column visibility. I believe there's a way to hide columns. Labels, I'm not sure how to, let's see. Hide. Yeah, I can hide columns, right? So you can press here and you can hide a specific column, right? And then if I refresh the page, the columns are visible because this is only local state in this component. Got it. But then here we have page, per page, sorting, and these are all using use query state. Use query state is coming here from this library. I think it's coming from Nux, if I can see it here. Nux, use query state. This is essentially a simple custom hook that allows you to use the URL as state in the same way that you would use local state here, right? So instead of using use state, we're using use query state, and this gives us access to the state over here and a function to update it. And this is coming directly from the URL, right? So if you have the page over here, it should be in the URL somewhere. I know it's a little bit small, but let's change it to like 20. There you go. I changed per page, right? And now we have in the URL per page 20. And if I reload, now this value is going to come directly from the URL, and we have 20 set here, right? This is how this use query state hook works. And this is really cool because now you don't actually have to implement your own functionality to work with the URL. You can just use this hook instead and then just parse your values, right? Because they're coming from the URL, and then you're good to go. So that's pretty cool. We're doing all of this with sorting as well. Very cool. Then we have filter parsers over here, which takes all of our filter fields and essentially just parses them and then puts them in an object over here so that we can actually use them and pass them, I believe, to the table. I believe that's how this works, right? So this is just a helper function that just manipulates the data that is being passed through props. Nothing really fancy there. And then, yeah, exactly. We are then passing it to the actual use query state to the URL, so we can also store the filters in the URL. This is actually really cool because in just like, 15 lines of code, we actually took all of the filters and actually a dynamic amount of filters. It doesn't really matter how many filters we have or what kind of options we have. This function, this use memo kind of handles all of that. And then we're just putting it directly in the URL. When I implemented this, if I remember correctly, I did this manually because it was a highly custom solution. I think I just manually kind of handled every single case of all the possible filters that we can have and just put those manually in the URL. This was a couple of years ago, so don't roast me. But now with just this custom hook over here, right? And then this use memo over here, we can just do that for any amount of fields in any way that they currently show up. Yeah, that's really cool. Then we have use debounce callback, which is just a way to get a debounced function that runs after a certain amount of time. And we're using that to set the filter values, right? So not changing the values directly of the filters, but just waiting for some milliseconds before actually making that update. Pretty cool, right? Then we have some pagination here on pagination change, pretty standard stuff. We're just going to actually set, I believe, yeah, we're just going to set the pagination over here on sorting change as well. And then we are having the initial column filters, which again does something similar with a reduce function, and then just creates an array out of all of these things. So yeah, pretty simple. Yeah, these are the column filters. Yeah, okay, I got it. These are the column filters, which I believe, yes, I believe, yeah, this is the advanced filters. Yeah, exactly. So right, we have the advanced filter here. If I go to advanced mode, right, we have our filters here. We can add something, we can remove it, we can reorder it, right? This is this state variable here, this column filters over here, that gets updated every single time that we make a change. Really cool. Then we have some other code, right, that does the searchable columns, filterable columns. Again, I'm not going to go too deep into this, but I think just filters them based on field.options. Fair enough. On column filters change, just updates the column filters, right? And this is like, you know, we're doing a lot of like reduce, we're doing a lot of like verbose code over here, but this is the reality of like life. If you want to build something complex, like this table component over here, you have to write code that is verbose, but this is not even that bad. We're like 300 lines inside of this custom hook, and it's still pretty fine. Like it's not that deep or that complicated. And I think we're even at the end. Yeah, there you go. And then with all of that, we just use this use React table, which I believe is the custom hook from Tanstack table. Yeah, this looks like it is. Yeah. And then we're passing the props, and then we're passing our custom props over here, which is a lot, fair enough, but it gives you the table, and then you can just directly use the table and it just works, right? And then we are returning here this table over here, which again is being used in all of our other components, right? So we have here 355 lines of code, 56 technically, and this is all that we need to handle most of the functionality of our table, right? This is pretty cool in terms of the logic of the table with the URL and all of that, right? And the concept remains simple, right? You just have one component that dictates the actual specific table that you want, in this case, the tasks table. It uses this component to handle the reusable logic of that table. And then, if I'm not mistaken, we can go here. We're then getting this table over here, this variable that we get from Tanstack table from the custom hook, and then we're passing it to our data table component. We're passing it to the advanced toolbar component, to the advanced toolbar actions, to the toolbar, and to all of our sheets and everything that it needs, right? Look at this component, the tasks table. You need 189 lines of code to create a tasks table, right? That even has a bunch of lines for all the different types over here, and even has some redundant filters, because I mean, more often than not, you're not necessarily going to want to support both advanced filter fields and non-advanced. You might, right? In this case, it does, right? But again, this is not a lot of code to get the functionality of running this entire table over here, right? I mean, I should maybe clear the URL so we can actually get some results, right? This entire table over here, right? And this is really cool. I'm really loving this. This is a great example of code that is a little bit more advanced, a little bit more complex, right? This is not necessarily beginner friendly. There's a lot going on here, but if you follow the patterns, if you follow the path, you can understand things. And again, this follows the single responsibility principle, which I talk about so much on the channel, right? This component over here, this tasks table, its only responsibility is to pull together all the different pieces that it needs to render out the table of tasks. That's it. That's its single responsibility. The custom hook over here, right, this use data table only has one responsibility, which is to build the functionality, the logic of the table, and then return that table over here. That's its only responsibility. This data table component over here, its only responsibility is to actually render out the individual UI pieces of the table as long as it receives this table as a props. That's the only thing that it has to do. Once again, it follows the single responsibility principle. The single responsibility principle doesn't necessarily mean that your components have to be extremely small, right? This component is 180 lines of code. This component here is 100 lines of code. This one is 350 lines of code, right? It doesn't mean that things have to be small. It just means that things have to focus on doing one thing, even if the code required to do that one thing is very verbose and you have to pull multiple things together, right? That is normal. This still follows the single responsibility principle. So there you go. That is the code base. I highly recommend that you check this out, clone this on your local machine, play around with this. I promise you, this is really important, because writing senior code like this is what is going to make you a senior React developer. Understanding all of these different things, understanding where to put things in a custom hook and a custom component is what is going to make you a senior React developer. And this, once again, is using all the tools that now in modern React we are using. It's using Tanstack table, React 19, the React compiler, it's using Shadcn. So if you want to have a table like this in your applications, use this. Do not build your own table unless you want to learn or unless you need some sort of custom functionality. But even then, even if you need some obscure custom functionality, which is beyond what this table provides, just take this table over here, add your custom functionality, and remove some of the code that you don't need. It's much better to take this as a base than it is to create your own component, because again, all of the work has been done for you and it's been done really well. So there you go. That's all that I have for this video. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave it a big thumbs up. You can also click here to subscribe, which you should. It's completely free. Or you can click here to watch a different video of mine that YouTube seems to think that you're really going to enjoy. And with that being said, my name has been Shadcn. This is Shadcn Solutions. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Ciao.